up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamona and Danny Abdeljabbar. Are you finished with whatever it is that you're doing, Danny?
One more time.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up? Are we good now? Did you settle your affairs?
I'm chilling, man, as per usual. And yes, all affairs have been settled.
Okay. This is the third time we had to do this because every time Danny was, I don't know, what were you doing?
I had to stand up to turn off the AC so that the audio could sound nice.
I gotcha. Well, I appreciate that. It is actually getting hot, so that is going to be a problem pretty soon.
Pretty soon.
pretty soon. And recording in the summer sucks for the entire family because we have central air, and I have to turn the AC off for an hour and a half, and then it's not just hot in here, but everyone finds it hot, and they're like, ugh, when are you going to be done with this? It's so hot. So, you know, it is what it is, right?
Yeah, it is.
You all have crosses to bear. But yeah, thanks for joining me today for another episode. We are going to be speaking about a topic that some people will look at the title and automatically get upset. However, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be just an interesting episode about just some very strange circumstances people found themselves in during World War II, specifically Jewish people who ended up serving in the Wehrmacht and in some cases even the SS.
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, when you sent your proposal to cover this topic, I was like, hell no, I'm not covering this. And then I read it, and yeah, it's a little clickbaity. It's interesting.
It's not. We're not gonna. This episode is not going to be like, well, you say Hitler was so bad and hated Jews, but like, did you know that there were Jews in the German army? No, it's not like that. It's just an interesting case study of different people who found themselves in interesting circumstances. But we can start this off by talking about Erhard Milch. You know who that is?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's the aviation genius of the Third Reich. The guy basically like built the Luftwaffe from scratch.
Yeah. So a lot of people don't realize how important Milch was to the German war effort. Without him, there's no way that the Luftwaffe would have been ready for a major war. Before the National Socialists came to power, Germany's Air Force was just non-existent. After the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles banned Germany from having any type of military aircraft. So what little aviation Germany had was all civilian. Like they had like glider clubs and commercial airlines. That was the German aviation industry.
Right.
Now, Milch had very serious credentials. He's he served in World War I. He actually started out in artillery, but he transferred over to the German Air Service, and he flew combat missions. He eventually commanded squadrons, and he saw the first, like the early days of like the horror of the early days of air combat, which was just, if you ever read about it, it was unbelievably frightening to be a pilot during World War I, and unbelievably deadly too. The mortality rate is something crazy.
Right.
Well, after the war, Germany wasn't allowed to have a military air force. So Milch went into civil aviation, and he helped what became Deutsche Lufthansa, the airline that would eventually turn into
Deutsche
Lufthansa.
Deutsche Lufthansa. Yeah.
Deutsche Lufthansa, which would later become the Lufthansa, and he became one of the top executives there. So he basically turned it into a real aviation network. And remember, this was technically a civilian program, but in reality, he was laying the groundwork for future military use. So when the National Socialists took power, Goring, who had also flown with distinction during the First World War, he knew exactly who to call, and he brought in Milch into the Ministry of Aviation, and he gave him the task of building Germany's aircraft industry from the ground up.
Right.
And he basically turned what was like a flying club into a modern air force in a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
The guy was a bona fide genius.
Yeah.
But did you know he was Jewish?
Yeah. I actually did hear that one. There's a weird ass story behind that though, right?
It's a very strange story. So Milch's father was Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
Under racial law, that should have been a death sentence to his career.
Mm-hmm.
Technically, he was a Mischling, meaning he was half Jew,
Mm-hmm.
which still would have made him ineligible for military service, let alone holding a prestigious command.
That's right.
But Goring needed him.
Mm-hmm.
So what Goring did, was that they made up this story. Goring literally he forged papers claiming that Anton Milch, his Jewish father, wasn't actually his father at all, and he arranged for Erhard's mother to submit a sworn statement claiming that Anton Milch was not Erhard's biological father.
Mm-hmm.
His real father,
here's where it gets weird.
his real father supposedly was his mother's uncle, who conceived Erhard out of they don't go into the specifics of how this conception worked, but it was either presumed it was out of wedlock, obviously, in either some type of predatory relationship or
Mm-hmm.
at the very least some type of incestuous extramarital affair.
Yep.
Thus making, but that affair would make him technically not Jewish. So
Right.
they filed an affidavit saying that Milch was of a pure Aryan descent, and her uncle was also, he was like a nobleman as well. So Hitler personally signed off on it, and then the problem was solved. And the next thing you know, Milch is promoted to field marshal. So he was a half Jewish field marshal in the German military.
So it's fucking wild. I mean, that's you go from half Jewish to bastard incest baby, and somehow that's cool. That's cool. That's cool enough.
It wasn't. That wasn't the truth. The truth
I know,
was that was his real father. But
it's just that's their moral compass says that like it's cool to be a bastard incest baby. That's totally fine. Which you don't choose to be a bastard incest baby. It's more than you choose to be Jewish in that way. So they're both the same, but it's funny that they choose one over the other.
It was one of those things that everyone understood the truth, but they just had to have the legal work.
The Fuhrer signed off on it, so no one had any recourse to say anything about it, right?
Because he was that important. But the thing is, though, is that this wasn't Milch wasn't some isolated case,
right?
And I'm getting the vast majority of this information from Brian Mark Rigg, and he's a historian. He wrote this big study probably about 10 years ago or so, and the study is called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. And using his methodology, he's Jewish too. So, by the way, he's not some crazy. He's a Jewish guy, and he estimates approximately 150,000 men of Jewish descent served in the German military during the Third Reich era.
Mm-hmm.
And he came to this figure, like it was essentially by going through military archives and personal files, and then he conducted about 400 different interviews with veterans, and the interviews are really like he in the footnotes the interviews are there, and a lot of them are really interesting. He's not only interviewing Jews, but he's also interviewing people who served with Jews. And then, they're telling him like, hey, like we knew he was Jewish the entire time. We just didn't say anything. Like, like everyone knew he was Jewish, but it was it's a really interesting book, and I've been wanting to do. I've read this maybe 6 months ago, a year ago, and I've been wanting to talk about it for a while.
I mean, I think
But what do you think?
that's fucking crazy. 150,000 people. I mean, like, I always knew that, Nazis were pretty strict about their racial laws, but basically what you're saying is that thousands of guys with Jewish ancestry were serving in uniform, and, the regime at the same time is like trying to wipe the Jews off the map. Like, how does that even happen? Like a couple here and there that were important. Like, I could see why, I could see why Milch would have been someone that they would have gave like a pass to, but this is 150,000 passes, right? Like, were the higher ups just like looking the other way, or was it just about who you knew or to whose whose proverbial ticks were they sucking to look the other way? You know what I mean? Like, what's going on here? It's just weird.
Well, the thing is, though, when ideology faces reality, there starts to become problems.
Mm-hmm.
You can't run a modern state by pulling competent people out of key positions just because of their ancestry.
I'd agree with
I mean,
that.
you're going to sabotage yourself if you do that. So, in
Right.
many cases, they had to bend their own rules. So they made exceptions, and these were usually done quietly because someone still had to keep the machine running. The real
Mm-hmm.
problem is that the problem that you run into with this is like they could never really agree on who counted as a Jew in the first place.
Right. I mean, that's kind of like the real question. Like, according to them, what is Jewishness, right? Are they going by like the biblical details? Are they going just by some fraction of their heritage? Somebody in their family might have been Jewish. Like, what was their standard? What even is
Well,
Jewishness
it was
according to them?
so according to Goring, when he was getting Milch's affairs in order, he famously quote, "I decide who's Jewish."
Ha! Hmm. All right.
So, but yeah, I mean, the question is like, is it religion? Is it a culture? Is it people still, and people argue about this topic today.
Right.
People, people are, in like the Israel Palestine debate, people are taking each other's Jew cards away from them. Sometimes
Yeah.
if you hear like a liberal Jew and a conservative Jew arguing,
Mm-hmm.
but is it a religion? Is it a culture? Is it an ethnicity? Is it a race? Is it blood? Is it belief? Or is it like someone who does Jewish things? Like what? That's the problem with it. So legally, before the National Socialist, the German state didn't treat Jews as a race.
Mm.
The legal systems in both the German Empire and the Weimar Republic recognized Jews as the same way they recognized, Catholics or Protestants as a
Right.
religious community.
Mm-hmm.
And under that framework, if you converted or intermarried, you could fully assimilate. And that's what a lot of Jews did. And it wasn't like Jews were strangers to German society. They had been living they've been living in the lands of what turned into the German Empire for a very long time, really
Mm-hmm.
since the Romans,
Mm-hmm.
since they started migrating and settling there. I don't know the exact. I don't know the
Rhine
exact
River.
time, but it was like the
Mm-hmm.
early, like 400 AD or so.
Yep. Mostly around the
It's a
Rhine
long
River.
history.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, mostly along the Rhine River and places like Cologne. And during the Middle Ages, Jews often settled in towns where local rulers would give them charters. So they were mainly invited. Often they were invited for economic reasons, and they had developed credit systems. Many were literate; they could handle administrative tasks for different princes and fiefdoms across the region. So fast forward to the 19th century, Jews in Germany were among the most assimilated in Europe, much more so in Russia and Poland and even parts of Austria-Hungary. They had civil rights. They could go to university. They could work
Mm.
in government. They served in the military. When when the German Empire was unified in 1871, Jews were granted full legal equality, and many moved into into the professional middle class, and they assimilated into German society. They saw themselves as German first,
Right.
while at the same time, though, their counterparts in the East, especially under the Russian Empire, there was a very different situation. The Jews in the Russian Empire were segregated in ghettos. The majority of the world's Jews lived in the Pale settlement in the Russian Empire, which is basically like this big strip of land, on which what is now on the border that kind of runs through Poland and Lithuania.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
For people who don't know, the Pale settlement was this massive region in the western part of the Russian Empire. It's where the Jews were legally allowed to live, and it stretched from modern day Poland through Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, all the way down to the Black Sea. The Russian Tsars didn't want anything, to do with the Jews, and they didn't want the Jews living in the heart of Russia, like in Moscow or St. Petersburg. So they basically locked them into this like middle zone, almost like the buffer zone between the Russian Empire and the rest of Europe. And inside the Pale, Jews faced all kinds of different kinds of restrictions, where they could live, what jobs they can get, whether they could attend a school or own property. And by around the late 1800s, something like 4 to 5 million Jews were crammed into the Pale, and it was incredibly overcrowded, poor. It was regularly hit with pogroms. Just basically state-tolerated mob violence. It wasn't a very nice place to live. And when you compare that to the experience of German Jews at the time, who by then could attend a university, enter elite professions, even serve in the officers' corps, it was a huge contrast.
yeah, and to be blunt, a lot of German Jews looked down on them.
Mm-hmm.
They saw them as poor and backward, and a lot of them were uneducated.
Mm-hmm.
It was a real cultural divide. So you got to imagine it from the perspective of a middle class German Jew, someone who's gone to university. Maybe they practice Reform Judaism. They speak perfect German. They dress like any other professional in Berlin or Frankfurt. Now, picture this person. They encounter a poor Jewish worker from the Russian Empire. Someone who lives on the frontier, maybe in some like shtetl, who speaks Yiddish and works in a factory or like sells secondhand goods out of a push cart.
Yeah.
It's a real division. Maybe this guy, there was more, maybe this guy's Hasidic
Mm-hmm.
and wears like long coats and speaks a language where the German Jew doesn't even understand.
Mm-hmm.
And then it wasn't just like a language thing. It was just kind of a lifestyle thing. It was a class thing.
It's a cultural
And
thing. Yeah.
part of this divide came out of the Industrial Revolution. In Eastern Europe, a lot of Jews had historically run dry goods shops and worked as traders and moneylenders, and they were artisans. But by the late 19th century, and we talked about Hannah Arendt in her books
Mm-hmm.
on this podcast, and she explains the situation of Jews in Europe. But this economy collapsed in the 19th century. Like it was a lot of Jews in the East, like they lived in complete destitute.
Mm-hmm.
And big industrial cities started swallowing up these small towns, and then the railroad industry crushed local commerce. Suddenly these Jewish communities were plunged into poverty.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of them worked in factories or they were unemployed, but they were essentially living on the fringes of society. And that's one of the reasons why the Bund, which is the Jewish social labor movement, became such a big force in Eastern Europe. It's why why a lot of Jews became Marxist in the East.
Mm-hmm. And that right there is that like the Eastern poverty, that factory life and the rise of the Bund and the Jewish labor movements, that's one of the big reasons why I think Jews became synonymous with communism in the minds of so many Europeans at the time. You had this Jewish name popping up in Marxist circles, underground printing presses, labor organizing. And for conservatives and nationalists, and especially so in Germany, that became a really easy stereotype. Like, Jews are the ones that are stirring up the revolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question. It takes like a lot of
Mm-hmm.
study into that era, and the clash of civilizations that quote unquote takes place there. But yeah, I mean, it's it's uh it's a very complicated topic. The eventual association with Jews and communism, but going back to for German Jews, it was a very different world entirely. Of course, many Jews in Germany were also indeed socialist revolutionaries and had a similar experience as their Eastern counterparts. However, for the most part, many of them were integrated, more invested into the German state, and they saw themselves as Germans of the of Jewish faith, not revolutionaries or outsiders. It's a whole different identity from the shtetl Jew that's scraping by in Minsk or Galatia. So when the National Socialists come to power and suddenly all the Jews were being lumped together by blood, this divide, this sense of us versus them within the Jewish world just didn't disappear. It created a very confusing situation and even denial among a lot of German Jews who had spent their whole lives not part of the Eastern world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of them, a lot of Jews in Europe had already converted to Christianity at this point. So,
Yeah, then there was conversion,
mm-hmm.
and it wasn't just in Germany that this took place. This was all over Europe, but
Right.
it happened to be in Germany probably more so than other countries. In the 18th and 19th century, Germany, um, converting to Christianity, especially converting, most of them converted to Protestant. They didn't convert to Catholicism; they were converting to Protestantism,
Mm-hmm.
Lutheranism. Um, it was often a ticket to the establishment into civil service or academia and elite society. If you wanted a government post, it was much better to be Lutheran, and a lot of prominent families made that leap. Vladimir Lenin example. I mean, he's obviously from the Russian Empire, but his great grandfather converted.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Jew who converted. Not his great grandfather. His grandfather, excuse me, converted. He was a Jew that converted to Lutheranism, and had a very similar background. Like they were civil servants. Um, his parents became like heads of a school, I believe, but it was a common thing that happened.
Right.
So by the time you get to Berlin or Frankfurt or even Austrian cities like Vienna in the late 1800s, you got this whole class of Jews who are very secular. They're intermarried. Maybe they're three generations from Judaism. And under the old legal system, they meant that they weren't Jewish anymore, at least in any formal sense.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the irony. The German state used to allow people to stop being Jewish, but once the National Socialists came to power, it didn't really matter what you believed in. It was more, or it didn't matter if your grandfather converted. It was more about like your blood.
Right.
And once you go down that road, well, the question becomes who is a Jew,
Right.
and that's where the everything breaks down because even the National Socialists couldn't agree.
Right. I mean, it gets a little, it's a little like weird because like, how do you even decide? Like if someone's grandfather was Jewish, but then they were baptized as a Christian and had no connection to Judaism anymore, like, were they still considered Jewish under that Nazi law just because? Like, how far back did they want to go? Right? Because if you go far enough back, probably a whole lot of people are Jewish, right? um, I don't know.
So it didn't matter if your Jewish ancestors were on your mother's side or your father's side.
Right.
What mattered was the number of Jewish grandparents you had, so not the
Mm,
line of descent. And how it
okay.
worked was a person with, I have this written down, a person with 3 or 4 grandparents was classified as a full Jew.
3 or 4
So no
Jewish
exceptions, no
grandparents.
appeals. Yeah. A
Hmm.
person with 2 Jewish grandparents was called a Mischling of the first degree, basically a half Jew in their racial terms. And then a person with 1 Jewish grandparent was a Mischling of the second degree, a quarter Jew.
Hmm.
So you could
Hmm.
be baptized at birth, raised Christian your entire life, never set foot in the synagogue, and then still legally be branded as Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, the formal like legal framework for all this started in 1935 with the Nuremberg laws. Specifically, there was a law called the Law for Protection of German Blood and German Honor and the Reich Citizenship Law. Mouthful. And those laws were basically stripped full Jewish citizens from their citizenship. It banned marriages and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans, and it created that whole system of the racial classification.
Yeah, but even with these supposedly strict categories, it wasn't a hard science. So people with partial Jewish ancestry, so a Mischling, could sometimes apply for exemptions. They could be declared German blood if they had the right political connections, or if they were just useful enough to the regime.
So yeah, I guess what you're trying to say is like it's the laws were more like guidelines. It was initially supposed to be about racial purity, but it turned into this weird, you know, game of exceptions, right? Paperwork, favoritism, and lots of bending the rules. And then the question becomes, how do you even figure all this out? Like how do they go about categorizing people? Like clearly they had to set up giant databases, right? And they had to like look through, I don't know what, like church records or interview people. Like this wasn't the age of the internet, right? Like they don't have like databases like we do. How do you take millions of citizens and then start slicing them up by bloodlines? That's like the biggest family tree project, like manual family tree project ever.
Yeah, it is. And yeah, they didn't have computers or databases like we do today. So
Mm-hmm.
they like you said, they leaned heavily on church records. So they looked at things like baptism certificates and like marriage registries and things that would be kept by a pastor. If you wanted to be if you wanted to prove you're Aryan, you had to gather your family's documents, and then sometimes you would have to go back 3 or 4 generations, and you would have to present a birth certificate or something else that proved of your Christian ancestors. Um, if there was any doubt, officials would dig deeper into you, and then they would start digging into like synagogue records or cemetery registries, or they would even just interview people.
Mm-hmm.
They would interview your neighbors or your coworkers or your old classmates if they really like wanted to get you. They would figure out a way to get you. Basically, they would talk to anyone who might remember something about your family's background, and it just turned into like this massive paper chase.
Mm-hmm.
It the entire government departments were set up just to investigate racial ancestry, especially after the Nuremberg laws. And a lot of it wasn't even consistent because when you think about it, like different regions enforced it differently. Some investigators were probably strict,
Mm-hmm.
and then some were willing to not look the other way, or just like take fraudulent paperwork if you had the right connections, or
Take a
or
bribe,
um
maybe. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
or yeah, take a bribe. So it
Mm-hmm.
was probably it was probably a unique experience for everyone, depending on where you lived and who you were presenting these documents to.
Right. I mean, it sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare. It also sounds like an epic waste of time and money. Like, epic waste of time and money. Forget about the morality standards, right? Like, how inefficient this must have been, right? To just try and figure out how Jewish somebody is, right? Or the other way around, how Aryan somebody is just such a waste of time. Um, yeah, it's not like they could just like run a genetic test like they could right today. And even if they could, like, what would they even test for? Like, there's no like single like Jewish gene, right? Jewish communities are a mix of Middle Eastern and European and North African ancestry. It's not some neat biological thing you could just swab for. And like in the 1930s, like genetic science was still in its infancy anyway. They barely understood blood types, let alone anything close to DNA. So it's just
Yeah, you're right. There is no such thing as a Jewish gene.
right.
And I mean, like, I don't know when genetic science first became really prevalent, but 1930s, I don't imagine they had the ability to really do that at scale at the very
Mm-hmm.
least. Um, you could have had a guy who looked completely Aryan, so tall, blonde, blue-eyed, um, who had like no connection to Judaism at all. Probably didn't even know that he or she had Jewish ancestry, and then one day, just suddenly, he's classified as a Mischling.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a story from the Riggs book, and I'm gonna paraphrasing it because I don't have it right in front of me. But basically, he explains like the story of this guy. He's this tall blonde guy who looks like he would be on um on a propaganda poster.
Mm-hmm.
And the party knew that there was going to be a Michelin coming, and he arrives with his friend, and everyone is kind of expecting, they're looking for the Jewish guy, and they think the Jewish guy is his friend because his Jewish guy is like the shorter guy with like darker hair.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they figure out this guy is Jewish, the tall blonde guy, everyone was shocked. They're like, "Oh my god, that guy! Like, we all thought it was him. Your friend who was."
It's crazy. They'll judge a book by its cover, right?
Yeah, I mean,
But even then, like
people look
neither of
different.
these technically are Jewish, right? Like they're both of these people, I presume, weren't practicing Jews. And the
No,
Mischling presumably was either second or first degree Mischling, so like only half at most of his grandparents were Jewish to begin with. So
yeah,
like this person probably didn't identify as like identity was out the window at this point, right? They didn't care what you identified as, but he probably didn't identify as a Mischling. You know, probably identified as a German, right? Certainly
yeah.
looked like one, right?
That was the conundrum that many
Mm-hmm.
people, and you have to think about, like, that's got to be a pretty hard to go through,
Yeah.
um, to have this like classification thrown on you when you, in many cases, probably just had no, maybe you knew, but like it wasn't a big part of your life, and then you're like, oh shit, this might be a problem.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's there's so many contradictions in the story because sometimes looks did matter. Sometimes the National Socialist would flag people just because they look Jewish.
Right.
So it really depended. Sometimes they would look at you physically, and sometimes it was just a matter of looking at your paperwork. But the point is, it could be very arbitrary at times. And officially, it was supposed to be about bloodlines, but of course, like, stereotypes played a role, and of course, like, a big thing is like personal grudges because
Right.
if you know somebody, let's just say if you're competing with somebody or you have like a personal enemy, and you figure out that guy, or that person is a quarter Jewish, you can use that against them.
Right.
You
Like
can bring,
snitch
and
on
there's like
people.
plenty of
Yeah.
cases in the Riggs book where that happens, where like there's this bureaucrat who has this personal enemy, and then they kind of flag him as Jewish, and it may be like some of the cases were like nothing to do with it. They were like personal grudges, like dumb, stupid grudges.
Yeah.
Um,
And
where
I mean, just think
it
about
that
like
crazy.
the bureaucratic bullshit you had to go through when someone like when the German government thought that you were Jewish, right? Like you had to go find birth certificates up to 2 to 3, maybe even 4 generations back. Like you had to have your grandparents' birth certificates or like some other documentation proving that you weren't Jewish. Even if you absolutely weren't Jewish, maybe you just kind of looked Jewish, or maybe it's just like you said, Henry, somebody had a grudge on you and they said, "Hey, that guy over there, he's Jewish, and I happen to know it." And now you got to prove that you're not, because there wasn't any innocent until proven guilty on these types of stories. Now you got to waste all your time and put in all this effort, and it's still even possible that maybe you can't produce the documents to prove that you're not Jewish, even though you aren't Jewish. You know, in this case, it's crazy, and I think I kind of want to talk a little bit about like what happens when the Germans actually discover that somebody is half Jewish, or at least when they get the inkling that someone was half Jewish. Like, how did how did they decide which of these people, which of these Jews, half Jews, were able to serve?
So, um, if the Germans found out that someone was half Jewish, depending on the circumstances, you could be okay. So, during the war, Hitler and those closest among him started handing out thousands of basically they were exemptions, and they were sparing people with partial Jewish ancestry. And if they were seen as valuable or loyal enough. Um, so they had a document, and it was called the Declaration of German Blood. If you got one of these, you were officially reclassified of German or kindred blood. That meant that you could stay in the military, or you could keep your state job. You can even marry who you wanted. Um, things would you would be okay if you got one of these declarations. But a lot of time, like as you know, like anything like this that comes through a bureaucracy, a lot of it um, comes with personal connections and political favors. So you would have to submit your family racial charts, dig up whatever paperwork you could find, and then you'd have to get like a testimonial from your commanding officer or party patrons who are backing you up. Then your case would climb up the chain, from your local unit commander your or your party offices, and that would go up to the Reich Chancellery, and sometimes it would go to Hitler's desk,
Mm.
and Hitler would sign off on a lot of these cases. Now, the um, the legal fig leaf for this whole process came from Section 7 of the first supplementary decree to the Nuremberg laws. So the section gave Hitler personal authority in exemptional cases to declare a Mischling as of German blood. And the reason why they had this is because it was kind of like a pressure valve built into the racial system, because the truth is that a lot of these guys were needed, especially in the Wehrmacht. These guys were needed. So you had officers with decorated service records,
Mm-hmm.
their family traditions. They had a long family tradition in the military. Their units respected them. If you started ripping them overnight because of new racial definitions, that would cause a lot of problems.
Yeah.
And behind the scenes, there was two people really kind of managing this. There was well, at least managing the exemptions. There was Hans Heinrich Lammers, who was head of the Reich Chancellery. Uh, Lammers handled the paperwork, and he worked with racial offices, and he tried to keep things running. And he was a lot more lenient with these. But then you had Martin Bormann, who was Hitler's private secretary, and he was stricter, and he didn't like the exemptions. And as the war went on, Bormann gained more power, and it became harder and harder for people to get those those declarations approved.
Hmm.
So you had this tension within the regime itself. You know the the battle between the practical needs and then the battle of the ideological drive to purify everything.
Okay. Well, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of people, right? Like 150,000, as you're saying, people got some of these exemptions, at
And
least
that's
so
an
that
estimate, by the
right.
way. It's like not. It's
Just
like
gonna
done
we're
through a
gonna use that.
methodology,
It could have
and
been bigger, could have been smaller. Who knows?
could have
But
been
like,
less. It could have been more.
right. Let's just use that number
An
for
estimate. It's an
now. See,
estimate from someone who did a serious study on it. Let's just put it
yeah.
that way.
So like, you've got all these people that obviously had to have gotten an exemption somewhere along the line if they were able to serve in the military. But I want to know, like, can we talk a little bit about like the big name people? Because like, obviously, we're not going to go through 150,000 randos, right? Like, who are some like important, like high profile guys with like Jewish ancestry that actually got these exemptions?
So, Field Marshal Erhard Milch was probably the most famous one. The guy who kind of started the Luftwaffe from the ground up.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lot more prevalent in the Luftwaffe if you look at things. Milch's father was Jewish. Goring personally protected him. Another big one was General Helmut Wilberg. So Wilberg's his mother was Jewish, but he was declared German blood by the personal order of Hitler.
I mean, how did Hitler decide that he gets to get an exemption? How did he get that?
It was just because he was valuable. So
We would.
he wasn't just like a random officer.
Mm.
He was like one of the primary guys of the Luftwaffe. He helped write a lot of the air strategy in the Luftwaffe in the early days. So, he was writing like military doctrine, like how Germany would fight in the air. Like he was writing about like like aviation, like combat theory and bombing coordinations and all that type of stuff.
Mm.
So it was just, frankly, he was in too much demand to just pull out or to really mess with. When his Jewish ancestry came to light, specifically his mother was Jewish. That made him a Mischling. That should have disqualified him, but he was just too important, and Hitler overruled those rules in that case, and he gets the declaration of German blood. But there's another one. There's Bernard Roge.
Roga? Yeah, who's this?
Roga. So he was a captain in the German Navy, and he commanded the commerce raider Atlantis. So basically, this was a disguised merchant ship used to sink Allied supply vessels, and Roga was really, really good at it. So he was one of the most successful long-range naval missions of the warfare, and essentially, he was operating behind enemy lines and just sinking supply vessels,
Hmm.
which I imagine is an extremely hard job to do, especially against the British and the Americans.
Yeah.
Um, Now, Roger was a quarter Jew under racial law. He he had Jewish ancestry, but he wasn't considered a full Jew or a first degree Mischling. Still, that could have disqualified him from holding command, but his performance was so strong and his reputation was so solid, he was protected. So this was another case where Hitler stepped in and said, "No, we need him. We can't get rid
We
of
need
him."
this guy to sink the ships. Yeah.
But there were plenty of others. So there was colonels, there were majors. There was even cases of guys in the SS, which I mean it was far less prevalent in the SS, but
But it
it did
happened.
happen.
Mm.
They had they quietly had it. It wasn't something where they were like talking about exemptions. It was just things that were hidden. Um, but these people were shielded because again, they were too valuable to lose. And it just wasn't. It wasn't just officers in the military either. Even inside the elite circles of the National Socialists, you had people with Jewish ancestry. One of the and technically this isn't. I guess it's a little bit different of a case, but Magda Goebbels, the wife of Joseph Goebbels, her biological father left the family when she was young,
Mm.
so she didn't really have too much of a connection with him. And her mother remarried a Jewish man who basically raised her,
Hmm.
and she took that last name too, Friedlander, and the she was essentially legally adopted by her stepfather, even though I'm not sure if that's 100% confirmed or not. But either way, she was heavily associated with her Jewish stepfather. And here's the thing: Friedlander was her stepfather was deported to a concentration camp during the war, and he died there.
Mm.
Meanwhile, Magda Goebbels was married to one of Hitler's closest ministers.
Yeah, that's wild.
So again, you have this insane contrast, and it was just one of those things that no one talked about because it was just too politically inconvenient to bring up.
That's crazy. I'm surprised I didn't know about that, about Magda Goebbels. But then again, I don't really know very much about the wives of many of these elite Nazi people. So that's an interesting
Um,
story. Were there any other cases where like guys actually got found out? Like, I don't know, like a soldier who gets exposed for being part Jewish after they were already fighting. Like how did that work out?
so another case that is written about is Helmut Kruger,
It's a badass name.
and yeah, Helmut Kruger. So he was a Wehrmacht officer. He was serving with distinction when the regime uncovered he had Jewish ancestry. They were surprised because the guy was like totally committed to Germany. But during one of the racial investigations, they found out, and it didn't really matter how loyal he was or how good his service record looked at that point. Once the paper said he had Jewish blood, he was finished in that case, and then he was stripped of his rank, and he was kicked out of the army, and he was thrown into the civilian world.
Hmm.
And here's the thing: Kruger had no idea he even was Jewish until they started digging into his ancestry.
Yeah, sounds like this was probably created like a crazy culture of like paranoia. You know, like you've got guys like Milch who are completely embraced, right? They get protected at the highest levels, right? And then guys like this Kruger guy, he gets wrecked, right? Like I bet from Kruger's point of view, it probably didn't even feel like it was even really about race. It probably just felt like random or even political. Like somebody like pinned Jewishness on him, you know, for some reason, right? Maybe to settle a score, maybe to push him out, make room for somebody else. I don't know. I mean, that's how I would feel
Well, he
if I was
thought it
in
was
that.
a and he thought it was a personal vendetta,
Mm-hmm.
and just the someone he believed the case was political.
It probably was.
Yeah, he believed it was political, and someone was out to get him. But you have to think about it, man. It's like, oh, yeah, you're because I don't. There's rumors of my grandfather being like part Jewish, and I'm not sure. I know
Mm-hmm.
there are rumors of it, but like,
Can you produce a document that
um,
says that you were definitively not Jewish?
I don't think I could.
Neither could I, in fairness.
I mean, actually, I could under the national the the laws of those days because all four of my grandparents were baptized as Catholic. Actually, no, my grandmother and my paternal grandmother was a Methodist, and she converted to Catholicism.
Yeah, but can you get your hands on that documentation?
Well, definitely not my grandma's because she was born in fucking Tulsa, middle of nowhere in Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
But I bet I could find. Mm, Could I find my grandfather? Probably not my grandfather on my dad's side because they were born in the Soviet Union. Well, no, they weren't born in the Soviet Union. They were born before the Soviet Union. They fled the Soviet Union after. My grandfather would be like 120 years old if he was alive
Hmm.
today. He had my father when he was turning 50, so
Jeez.
he was like super old. Um, but he fled. He lived in he was Polish, but his family was from Kiev. Uh, Essentially, they were like uh, ethnically cleansed, or they were maybe ethnically cleansed is not the right word, but um, they
Forcibly
were pushed
removed.
out of. They were removed under the threat of violence. Let's just put it that way,
Okay.
to leave their home in Kiev. I don't know the full story, but
Long story short, you
they had to be
can't.
smuggled out. All right,
Right?
yeah, all right. I don't want to go down too far
Yeah.
memory lane, or not my memories, but my ancestral, my heritage. But okay, so where was I? I just lost my train of thought. Thank you for saving me. Okay, I think I know what I was talking about. So yeah, you had every reason to if you were accused of being Jewish, you had every reason to believe that it was a political case.
Hmm.
In the case of Kruger, he wasn't an outsider. He was a good soldier. He was respected, but sometimes it just came down to like who had more influence, and who, if your enemies were talking to or whispering to the right people to get you fucked. And because the whole racial classification system um, was so dependent on interpretation, it was just very easy to weaponize. And part of why Milch survived comes down to who he was close to, because Milch was obviously very tight with Goring,
Hmm.
and Goring had serious clout. I mean, he was there with the National Socialists from the early days. Um, he was loyal to Hitler and the party. And if you read biographies about Goring, it's pretty clear that he didn't really believe in the racial ideology. He didn't really care if someone was Jewish or not. He just cared if you can get the job done. And Goring was obviously not a mid-level person. He was a beloved public figure and a national war hero. And the guy had a lot of personal demons. He struggled with weight, and he was an alcoholic, and he had some kind of wild parties.
Hmm.
But despite that, he was a very like charismatic public person. And he was in the First World War. He was one of Germany's top fighter aces, and he was an outdoorsman. He was just he was loved. He was an extremely popular figure. So that kind of pull went a really long. If you were good with him, that obviously went a long way.
Right.
And the doors would stay open even if you had Jewish blood.
I mean,
And Milch was a Milch was obviously he knew him, but also he was a genius. So
yeah. So
it's
basically,
easy to
like
see how he was spared.
if you knew someone who had access to Hitler, or you were just so ridiculously indispensable, or both, like Milch, it sounds like your life was pretty easy.
Yeah, if someone close to Hitler, or even just like a commanding officer liked you, they could help you out. So it didn't really guarantee anything, but it gave you a fighting chance at least. Um, at the end of the day, Hitler himself would have the final word on these high profile cases, even with all the layers of bureaucracy. Um, but he was the one. The petitions would end up on his desk,
Hmm.
and if you were high ranking enough, it would be his call. But the thing is, though, he wasn't really consistent about it. So sometimes he'd move fast on it. Sometimes, he would never get to it. Like if you were on battlefield, if you were an officer with the critical battlefield command, um, you were, if you were leading like an armored division or something, you might get an exemption, within a couple of days. But a lot of other times, petitions just sat there, and then they'd be reviewed for a really long time. So these people lived in this state of limbo,
Hmm.
waiting for their approval process from the Führer's desk.
Just depends on whether or
And
not Hitler took his meth that day or not.
yeah, or some say that he did it. Briggs says that he did it. He liked to he liked to have let things fester, to stir things up a little bit. I'm not sure what the exact motivation was, but it could have been. But he clearly would shift his moods on the whole thing. Like, he would frequently shift his kind of opinion on it, a lot. So some days he would be cold to the idea of making these exemptions, and then other days he would be like, oh no, we need to get these people through. So like he wasn't even consistent. But the Vermont did push back a lot on on guys that they needed, and generals would go to bat for the men. So they would send letters up the chain, not mentioning race directly, but like talking about a guy's loyalty and their leadership and stuff like that, to get their guys approved that they needed. So it was, in some cases, like, commanding officers would threaten to resign too,
Hmm.
or entire units would protest if they pulled like a beloved guy for racial reasons. So, and that pressure would sometimes work. So there was like kind of this game that they had to play between between these units who may have had some key guys who were of Jewish ancestry, and the racial bureaucracy, because if they push too hard, then obviously you don't want a bunch of guys like resigning from their positions
Yeah.
in protest. So
Right.
it was hard to straight out. That's why you had 150,000 guys,
Right.
or allegedly or estimated 150,000 guys, because again, like,
Because all
how
this
are you going to yank
nuance.
them all
Right.
out?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So like wasn't like Emile Maurice Jewish?
Yeah, that's like another famous case. So he was half Jewish, so technically a Mischling of the first degree, and he was one of Hitler's oldest friends and
Mm-hmm.
closest associates, and we're talking about the early days. So back when the um the National Socialists were a bunch of beer hall agitators,
Yeah.
he was one of the founding members
Mm-hmm.
of the SS. So he was SS number 2. Number 1 was Hitler,
Right.
but that's how close they were. And he was, he was Hitler's his bodyguard, his chauffeur, kind of acted like a fixer for him.
Yep.
And he was, one of his primary guys in the early days. He went to prison with him. He helped him write Mein Kampf. Hitler gave him an Aryan exemption,
Mm.
but after that, he ran into all sorts of problems. But the problems he ran into weren't with Hitler; they were with Himmler, and Himmler didn't like him, and they eventually sent him to. They like essentially didn't exile him, but they got him out of Germany. They sent him to Madagascar for something. I forget what the exact reason was, but
Sounds
they
like an
gave him a
exile to me.
post.
Yeah.
Yeah, they sent him on like a post that wasn't in the European war.
Maybe we can go through like a couple of specific case studies from the Riggs book. I know that there's like a shit ton of interviews in there, and we can't obviously cover them all, but let's talk about like a few that I don't know, maybe like reflect the struggles of like the common soldier rather than the high level officers. Obviously, we can't go through all of them, but like what was like the common thread?
Yeah. So I grabbed a couple of them, and just to go over their case study. And these are guys who are not so much high profile, but they were still, people who went through it. So one of them was Ferdinand Lischwitz. So this one stuck with me. So he was a Mischling of the first degree. So he was half Jewish, and he served as a funker. So it was kind of like a radio operator, and he enlisted as a signalman. And what he said and what he quoted was that in the army, everything was different. In the army, you were guarded from the Gestapo. So essentially, his feeling, he joined the army as a way to escape getting sent to a, a labor camp or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
So the army military service was essentially his safe space, because for him it was safer to be in the military than to be in civilian life. And within the Riggs book, that's kind of a common thing. Like a lot of the half Jews stayed in the army because it gave them cover. And there was another quote they say that he uses, that they claim that only in the Vermont could one escape the Nazis.
Be closer to them.
Yeah.
The closer you were, the farther you were. It's wild.
Well, this was, not the SS. This was their regular army, and
No, but
there was.
still, it's like hiding in plain sight. Serving in the army of the regime that wants you gone, and the uniform is inadvertently what protects you. Like you wouldn't think the Wehrmacht would be the safe space, but for guys like this Lischwitz guy, kind of was.
I mean,
So,
I could see definitely how that would be the safe space, because there was always a little bit of tension between the Wehrmacht and Hitler in the party.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
There was always tension between them.
Yeah, but it's still like poetically like ironic, right?
Yeah, ironically, yeah. But it's not like they were like the political part of
For sure.
the military. They were just like your regular army.
So what
They were
about when
just
like
normal
these
people.
what about when these Mischling soldiers actually encountered Jews in the East, like in Poland or Ukraine? How did they react to those Jewish communities? Given their own background, did they feel connected at all, or was there such a cultural divide that they saw them as still totally foreign, so that they're okay with doing fucked up things to them?
Yeah, it's pretty sad. So a lot of the Mischlings, and so Riggs wrote a lot about this book, a lot about this topic, and he writes about it because he's trying to tell you how weird it was for these German half Jews to be called to be considered Jewish to them. So a lot of the so they often expressed real contempt towards Eastern European Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it wasn't new. We spoke about it earlier.
Right.
But the German Jews often look down on Polish or Russian Jews as poor and backwards, or overly religious, or just not assimilated or modern enough.
Mm-hmm. They're just different.
So there was
yeah.
This was one of my guys who I wrote down. So Heinz Gunther Angris. So he was a half Jew serving as a Obergreifter during the invasion of Poland. I'm not sure what an Obergreifter is, to be completely honest.
Actually don't know what that word means. Obergreifter. Sounds like a higher position. The word Ober. It's a private first class or a senior lance corporal.
Okay.
It's an E3 rank, basically, in our army.
So during the invasion of Poland in 1939, as his unit was moving through Jewish areas, he actually said, and I'm quoting. Maybe I shouldn't even quote that because someone will try to take me out of context. But
Just say
I'll
it.
just,
It's fine.
in case. Okay, he said the Jews there look simply horrible. He even said, Dr. Sturmer, that insane Nazi propaganda rag hadn't exaggerated. So even he, with Jewish ancestry, had internalized a lot of anti-Semitic messaging.
Mm-hmm.
I'm quoting from the Riggs book right there.
Right.
And there's another guy. So Hans Muhlbacher, so another soldier with a Jewish mother. He was stationed in Poland, and he wrote in his diary, "It's awful what horrible people I see there. The grimacing faces, truly two worlds stand opposite one another." He blamed their appearances on centuries of inbreeding, called them Ashavuris, which is the anti-Semitic stereotype of the wandering Jew.
Hmm.
Another guy, so Friedrich Schling, Scheislinger,
Schlesinger.
Schlesinger, so also a half Jew, he said that he was appalled by the Polish Jews and horrified by the thought that his own ancestors might have looked like them. And then there's Hans Bernheim. He was a quarter Jew. He stood by while German troops beat Polish Jews and cut their beards. He later admitted that he was ashamed that he didn't intervene when a doctor from his own unit shot a Polish Jew in cold blood during a march. That's pretty grimacing.
Yeah.
But even then, he just kept walking. So what you're seeing is, is a broader trend in Riggs' point that a lot of these Mischlings were just like, they didn't really feel any kinship to the Jews that they encountered in the East. They, they saw themselves as German, and they saw these other communities as completely alien to them. Even with Jewish blood, and they didn't identify as Jewish. They saw themselves as Germans, and they stood there while atrocities unfolded around them. Like I think most people probably would. I mean, I'm not saying it was good. I'm saying most people don't have the courage to stand up against that type of thing.
That's true. And these groups of people like aren't monoliths, right? They're all individuals, right? So the fact that they're all Jewish, it's not really all that important. It kind of reminds me of how like people can internalize like a prejudice that's being used against them. Like I'm from Puerto Rico, right? Live in Puerto Rico right now, and sometimes you can see this more so in like the historical times and outside of the metro area, but you can see this like this idea of like lighter skinned Puerto Ricans looking down on like the Afro-Caribbean folks or the darker skinned Dominicans, even though they're neighbors, even though they're family in some cases, probably genetically indistinguishable from one another, there's this idea this colonial mindset that runs so deep that people start like policing their own identities, or like in Latin America more broadly, like you have these whole generations of indigenous or mixed race people trying to like artificially whiten their lineage through marriage, pretending to be Spanish, trying to distance themselves from, the people that they came from. Same shit in the US, like black folks who could pass as white, and just kind of lean into that. Some did it to survive. Some, looked down on others who couldn't. It's a lot of the same dynamics here. A lot of these Mischlings, they were just trying to survive in Nazi Germany, and they leaned hard into the German part of their ideology and their identity, and they just basically disowned or even despised the Jewish parts of themselves. And it wasn't what they identified as, right? Like in this case, in these historical cases, your identity didn't matter, right? You were just pinned with something that you didn't choose. But I mean, we see a lot of those same things today. I mean, it's tragic, but it's also kind of predictable when you think about how power twists your identity, right? What I'm really taking away from all this, I think, is just that there there wasn't one single Jewish experience in the Wehrmacht. It sounds like, even within that subgroup of Jews, it wasn't the same, and it sounded like there was a broad spectrum of shit going on, from guys who got purged or punished to others who barely even noticed.
Yeah, and going back to those analogies, it kind of reminds me of kind of like white Union soldiers coming across like what they saw as like poor Southern trash
Yep.
during the Civil War,
Mm-hmm. They're all
or like
American, but
poor
they're
white
like,
Southern trash.
mm-hmm.
There was like a lot of that because, in this country, there was a lot of prejudice against just people from the South in general,
Mm-hmm.
especially after the war.
Mm-hmm.
They would, Northerners wouldn't rent out rooms to them and those types of things. If they heard a Southern accent, they'd be like, "Oh fuck, people with Southern accents are coming here."
Yeah.
So it's kind of, there's a lot of different analogies, but there's again, there's diversity within groups. I mean, it's hard to even categorize these people within the same group given how different their cultures are.
Yeah.
But yeah, going back to the I guess the main crux, your experience really would just depend on who you served
Yep.
or who your commanding officer was. So there was plenty of cases where guys would just make the problem, like commanding officers would just make the problem go away. So there was another one. So Dieter Fischer is another case study he used. So his mom was half Jewish, and his commanding officer knew it. But instead of acting on Hitler's racial degree, the officer told him, "We'll deal with it after the French campaign." So that delay led Fischer to prove himself in combat. The thing is, though, Fischer is actually discharged into civilian life later on in the
Mm-hmm.
war. The whole unit, including the commander, walked him to the train station and then showed him just mad respect. And then there were Horst Greitner, there's another half Jew. So he served in Goring's elite guard battalion. When he told his lieutenant about his ancestry, his lieutenant just winked and said, "You have nothing to fear." And Geithner, he stayed and he fought and he received an Iron Cross
Yikes. Wow.
from the same officer who knew his background. And then another one I got is Paul Ludwig Hirschfeld. This one is pretty interesting. So he was fully he was fully Jewish, but
100%
he
Jewish, all
managed
four
to
grandparents.
managed to fake his identity, and he rise to first lieutenant, and he saved his entire regiment in battle. And meanwhile, he helped forge travel documents for Jews and even protected his Jewish fiance. His officers knew, but they turned a blind eye. And his nickname in his unit was the Wise Jew.
Wow.
And this wasn't just like a one case, like a one-off case of guys like, you know, not turning in full Jews as well. Um, it happened more than you would think. Let's see, who else do I got right here? So Colonel Rolf Menneking. You speak German. Am I pronouncing that
Yeah, that
correctly?
one's fine. Medicing. Mm-hmm.
Menneking. So when he transferred command, he told his replacement, "These three officers are non-Aryans. No one knows but me. I promoted them anyway." And then he passed the responsibility on like a quiet pact of protection. And then General Werner Keinitz, who shielded Captain Robert Colley. Even when the Gestapo had paperwork proving Colley's ancestry, the general and his staff ignored it. Colley stayed in, rose to colonel, lost a leg in battle, still got decorated. And in the Navy, there were guys like Admiral Eugen Lindow and Commodore Ernst Wolf protecting Franz Mendelssohn, a quarter Jew who kept building ships for the war effort while technically in violation of the law. That's everyone I wrote down for today. But there's a lot of case studies. And you know, there's I would recommend people reading this book. It's pretty interesting. It's you know, I obviously just given this, you know, I've just rephrased what Brian Riggs wrote. So it's not like I did much research besides read his book, but I think it was a really good book. And
It's an interesting topic, man. I mean, there's like a lot of nuance in there and kind of very sad, but also incredibly
yeah,
interesting,
I think it's pretty tragic. I think it's, well, obviously it's pretty tragic. I think it's pretty sad. No, it's obviously has to fuck with your head.
Yeah.
If you imagine if you just like one day you're like, oh yeah, we discovered in your racial documents you're like some weird freak, and
Mm-hmm.
you're you're messed up, and you're like, wait, no, I'm not. You're like, yep, you have it.
I kind of deal with that
It's
right
got to
now,
mess with your
actually.
head.
Living in
What's
Puerto
up?
Rico, like I kind of deal with that right now, living in Puerto Rico. Like I'm half Puerto Rican. Um, but I was born in the States and I now live in Puerto Rico. And so I'm kind of like either a New Yorican, so a New York Puerto Rican, or a gringo, just generally speaking, because I was born and raised on the mainland. And so like there's a whole group of like Puerto Rican people who just do not accept me because despite the fact that I happen to be half Puerto Rican, identify as Puerto Rican, live in Puerto Rico, pay taxes in Puerto Rico, they don't give a shit. I'm just a gringo to them, which is wild. So like
Even you get called a gringo?
I by some of the extremists, yeah, hell yeah.
How many
But the
extremists
thing
are
is
there?
that the thing is that I pass, right? Like if I don't speak too much, nobody knows. But the moment that I start talking too much, because I speak Spanish, but like you can tell after a while that like clearly I wasn't born here. It was, it's not my primary language. And so I can envision a world where like, I don't know, maybe Puerto Rico becomes independent and then some, I don't know, radical nationalist group uh comes to power and then goes after all the gringos still remaining on the island because I don't know, remnants of colonialism or some shit like that. Like I could see that as being like I could give this prompt to ChatGPT and it could give me a whole like short story on it.
I think they would go after the white people first.
Of course, of course. But then after they go after the full white people, then they'll go after the only part white people. I'm not even white.
Yeah.
That's the funny part.
Well, they get confused because they'd be like, Abdel Jabbar?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, we don't
Surprisingly,
even.
there's a fairly large Arab Puerto Rican community in a neighborhood not too far from here called Atore or Rio Piedras, and there's a lot of like Lebanese Puerto Ricans and a number of Palestinian Puerto Ricans, and I thought I was the only one in the world. Apparently,
No, it's
there's
way
like a
more
decent
common than
amount
you
of them.
think.
Yeah,
It's actually pretty common in like Venezuela and like El Salvador. You know, President
Bukele. Mm-hmm.
Bukele, he's Palestinian.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
It's just like
it
uncommon in the
is
United States, but like I guess kind of more common in
in Latin
actual.
America.
Yeah.
A lot of refugees from the Lebanon civil wars. They moved to South America,
Mm-hmm.
so or Central America. So it actually it's pretty common to
Some of them made their way to Puerto
to
Rico,
find
and
people in
that's
Latin America with like Arab last names.
mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm done
You're
for
done.
today. Unless you would
Okay.
like to go
Nope.
deeper into it.
No, we're good.
Okay. Well, I hope everyone liked this episode. Again, the book is called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers by Brian Mark Riggs. It is on Amazon. So if you're interested going deeper into this topic, that is the really only definitive study on this topic. So that's where you're going to learn about it. All right. Anything you want to plug before we go? Our Slack, not our Slack, our Substack.
You said it again. Substack, yeah. Come join us on the Substack. We've been doing a lot of extra content there. We do extra episodes called Shoot the Shit, where we just kind of have a little bit looser, unstructured conversations. And we also release all of our regular episodes early there. And if you get annoyed by all of the ads, you can listen to them ad-free on the Substack, and it's really inexpensive, so you should just go ahead and check us out there. You can also talk with us directly, so it's a fun time. Come join us over at the Substack. It'd be really appreciated.
Yes, come join the club.
All right.
All right, guys, peace.